And now, streaming live from the Newman Library Athenaeum on the Blacksburg campus of Virginia Tech, it's Vox Humanities Conversations with your host, the director of the Center for Humanities at Virginia Tech, Dr. Sylvester Johnson.
I'm Sylvester Johnson, and this is Vox Humanities Conversations, a live streaming program from the Center for Humanities at Virginia Tech. As with all productions under the Vox Humanities media imprint, the Conversations Initiative places its focus on the advancement of human-centered knowledge. We do this by engaging with experts and scholars whose work explores human life and human culture through a critical lens, and that serves to enhance public understanding around the impact of social disparity in a complex world. What makes Conversations unique is an emphasis on sharing stories that connect us to the humanity within the humanities. And for each episode, we invite one or more guests to open a window onto the story of their scholarship, both the story that stands behind their work and the story that lives within. Over the past decades, America's colleges and universities have increasingly recognized the vast importance of engaging with the entire population of students who matriculate and immerse themselves in campus life and academic instruction. This has included students in LGBTQ+ communities, that is, students who are lesbian, gay, bisexual, transgendered, and queer identified. LGBTQ+ students have unfortunately faced many acts of discrimination and even violence that undermine and violate their civil and human rights, that create hostile social conditions and environments, and even threaten their lives. Academic institutions are an integral part of our society, and they have a mission that means serving all students. How have higher education institutions worked to create more fairness and inclusion as they serve student populations that continue to reflect the diversity of our world? Are some strategies more effective than others? What does research tell us about the effective means to achieving socially just outcomes for the educational lives of students in colleges and universities? Our guest today, Professor Chase Catalano, is an expert on these issues. Welcome, Professor Catalano.
Thank you.
We're delighted you can join us. So let's start by you telling us what you do here at Virginia Tech. What's your role?
I'm an assistant professor in the School of Education, specifically in the higher education program. And I teach and research and hopefully participate in service that advances inclusion efforts at the university.
That's great. Well, let's talk about some of the things that lie at the heart of your research. So why is it important for institutions of higher education to take a proactive approach to fostering a positive environment in order for students to thrive?
Well, I think if anything that we've seen in contemporary culture right now, with legislative attacks on trans and queer youth, that I think undermine their dignity, erase their existence, to issues happening in Florida with not recognizing AP African American history as a valuable class or contribution to the curricula. While these things are happening in more and more P through 12 settings than higher education, we will feel the ripple effects of that. Those students who start in primary school, middle school, and high school will end up, hopefully, in our colleges and universities. And I think it behooves us to do the work to anticipate their arrival, to create spaces that anticipate them and welcome them without them having to do a lot of self-advocacy to say, I'm here, what is available for me? And instead for us to say, we knew you would eventually show up here. Here are the things that we've provided.
Yeah, no, that's helpful because you're right. There are a lot of different things happening nationally and even globally that are relevant to the research that you're doing. I know there's a long history of efforts by colleges and universities, so our higher education institutions, to figure out, design, and implement whatever their own programming has been or their operations and structures have looked like that relate to student life. That's everything from the on-campus activities outside of classes to the way the academic instruction operates, etc. Could you summarize some of the things that have been important factors pre-now, or pre-2000s, because a lot has happened over the past several decades for LGBTQ students who are part of these colleges and universities. You know, today is, or if we go back even 5 or 10 years, that's different from the 1980s or the 1990s.
Absolutely.
Could you give our viewers and our listeners a sense of what some of that has been like, say, before the 2000s, and then what's happened more recently, as just some background for what they might be hearing or seeing today?
So historically, and I am not a historian, I'm just playing one right now on this broadcast, queer and trans students were active on campus and doing activism as far back as the 70s. The NYU takeover that happened, that was actually part of Sylvia Rivera and Marsha P. Johnson were involved in that takeover, right? So we have this long history, this long, beautiful history of resistance and activism and demands, right? These student demands led to what happened in the 80s, which is, and then the mostly early 90s, which led to creations of cultural centers, cultural identity centers in higher education. And those were higher education leadership responses to student demands for inclusion. It became something that institutionalized inclusion in the institution and placated activists. However, what we also know is that they are often under-resourced and understaffed. So they became a placating device. At the same time, in the 80s and 90s is when we see the emergence of things that we started to call diversity workshops. And so this is when we recognize that just the existence of more diverse populations on campus actually doesn't change the dynamics on campus. And so what are the efforts that we can do? Well, we should probably train faculty and staff to be more open to think about experiences beyond their own.
Okay.
And that led to, in the 90s, what became safe zone, safe space trainings. They started to become popular in the 90s, and they persist today. And I started calling them social justice educational interventions, because their goal, hopefully, is to interrupt the assumption that everyone is heterosexual, the assumption that everyone is cisgender or not trans. And they continue to exist on a variety of campuses across the United States. Campuses that have LGBTQ plus resource centers and campuses that don't. It's a pretty familiar training.
Yeah.
And so often folks who work at different colleges and universities might go from one institution to the next and say, oh, I already went to a safe zone training at my previous institution, except the curriculum might be completely different at the new institution that they're working at. And the hope is that this is a way to gain more inclusion, gain more acceptance, interrupt behaviors, create new behaviors, and I mean, in my head, help set new intentions of what we want to see happen on campus.
No, that's fascinating, because your work has included a focus on the social justice education intervention as an important factor in making it possible for the goals of inclusion, or in the experiences that students have, that all of our students have at our institutions, to get realized, if they can, to be an enabling factor. And so I'm curious to hear you say more about that intervention and what you and other experts have learned about it. But before we do, I'm wondering if you could reflect for our audience, since the work that our Conversations does is to help advance public knowledge and understanding about issues that are they're really complicated. And we try to do that in a way that is accessible to audiences. They may not be academics, they may not be experts on these issues. So what do you think are some of the reasons why it's important, why it matters to just understand some of the history of what you just explained, given the kinds of day-to-day conversations that people might hear in the media today about things like inclusion and diversity that have been part of the work that our higher education institutions have undertaken? Why does it matter to understand that history?
I think I want everyone to know, and I spend a lot of time thinking about what we're experiencing in contemporary U.S. and globally might seem new, right? There might be folks who are like, I've never heard of all of these genders. What do you mean I have to worry about people's pronouns? And I appreciate that for a lot of folks is not maybe a daily experience, depending on where you live and who's in your communities. And so I think this is a way to generate reality that we have always existed. Queer and trans people have always existed. Whether or not queer and trans people were recognized by governments, by legislatures, by doctors.
And usually have not been formally. Right?
Correct.
Right. That's part of what that history has been
Correct.
about. Right? Yes. Okay.
So I think this is a way of reminding folks we've always been here. We've always had needs, and there are lots of folks who have always been there to help. These are not isolated identities, right? The idea or the stories we tell, right? The most popular would be about the Stonewall Rebellion, right, in New York City, and the way people tell that story makes it seem like there was no activism prior to that, when we know there were what was called the Compton Cafeteria Riots, which happened in the Tenderloin District in California, in San Francisco, led by youth and drag queens, right? Mostly folks of color, queer and trans people of color, but those weren't stories or histories that we knew about. And so the telling of Stonewall as the birth of the gay liberation movement is a bit of a misnomer, right? There had been work with queer and trans folks in the Black Panther movement, in the civil rights movements prior, in the women's movement. And so while those histories were untold, it makes people believe, oh, well, what's happening now? This is very 2023.
Got it.
Oh, gosh, like there weren't all of these trans people before. There weren't all of these queer people, or because there was so much focus on gay marriage, I think, in the early aughts, the early 2000s,
Yeah.
the belief was that that was the biggest issue.
Right. Right.
And it also kind of led to the belief that marriage would save us all. And Dean Spade wrote a really powerful piece about why marriage will not save us all. And, you know, a lot of what's in that argument is the privileges and rights that folks get from having access to marriage that heterosexual people always had and took for granted certainly do help some of us, but those of us who are already struggling because we are not a single issue, single identity group, those who are lacking resources are not going to be benefited from having marriage as an opportunity. That's not going to solve the problems. However, affordable health care would be beneficial for everyone. Access to, I don't know, resources and services are helpful for everyone. And those also will help those more disproportionately impacted by the way that homophobia or transphobia has existed. And one of those was that we did not exist.
So that's several very important points that you have explained and presented that just demonstrate why having some knowledge and some understanding about the historical trajectories, about what happened before today or this week or, you know, the past 2 or 3 years is important. For knowing that is important for understanding what is happening today. I mean, one of the things you're raising is the idea of novelty, right? There are new identities or new issues. Why are these things getting invented or created in 2022 or what is now 2023? And what you're explaining is that over and over again, people might feel like something is new, but these have been continuing issues that have been part of the lives of people who've been part of human society, whether, and you can pick your vector of gender or gender identity, race or ethnicity, but these have been ongoing concerns that have been contested as part of a longer history of trying to get fairness, equal opportunities across society. So you're an expert looking at some of the interventions that have happened. Before the show, we were talking about graduate school and all the things we have to do. There's a lot of labor and work that comes into getting shaped into scholarly, and it's a lot of research that you have to do. So you've been able to learn some things from the research you've done, and I know you're continuing to do new work. But can you talk about some of the ways that the social justice education that is trying to teach people whose professional work, whose professional job responsibilities within the context of higher ed require them to fulfill the institution's mission for everybody, right? For all the students who are there, who reflect our world. Why the education to prepare them to do that work has been ongoing, and then what are the effects of it? Has it been effective, or are there things that have been effective? Are there things that have not been effective? So what have you and other experts learned from some of the research on that intervention?
So I'm going to start this way, which is that prior to becoming a faculty member, I lived a pretty full life as an administrator in student affairs. And I was the director of an LGBT resource center for 5 years. And in that work, it was both wonderful and exhausting.
Okay.
I think folks think about cultural center work, particularly LGBT resource center work, as having a very specific goal and a very niche focus. When the truth is, really, I was kind of like the dean of students. I was the everything in all the aspects for all of the queer and trans students on campus.
Okay.
So whether it was academic advising or career advising or love life and relationships or sexual health, things that I in no way knew anything about, and often had to develop partnerships and relationships across the institution to ensure I was supporting or finding resources for students. There's also only the students that chose to engage with us, right? There were lots of trans and queer students on campus who were perfectly fine not being engaged with us. Either they already had their own communities or they felt like maybe our space wasn't a very welcoming space to them, whether it was not racially diverse enough or ableist, because we didn't have, our center was not accessible if you had any mobility impairments in its original location. It's since moved to a more accessible location, but in my 5 years, that was a challenge. And so I did this work, and I was in love with it, and I couldn't shake the feeling that I was failing.
Okay.
I was failing these students. And there were a couple of things that led me to wonder about it. One of them was there were old Safe Zone stickers from the previous training that we had, the Safe Zone training for creating LGBTQ plus allies, for just an easy reference. And a student went to talk to a faculty member who had that Safe Zone sticker or Safe Space sticker on their door and came back with this horrible story about the really offensive things that the faculty member said that were really homophobic. And I thought, I don't know that I have any power to do anything about this. And so
this was supposed to be a safe space, but clearly was not.
And this sticker was supposed to indicate that this person had done some level of work.
Okay.
And yet this student is telling me that that's not what happened. And then a couple of months later, I was having a conversation in someone's office, and I pointed and told them about the sticker. And I said, you know, like the one you have on your door. And that person's response was, oh, I have one on my door? I didn't even know. Right? So folks move offices, but they don't necessarily remove everything from their door.
It was just an old sticker.
It was an old sticker on the door, and they hadn't even noticed it. And I was like, okay, so we have a little bit of an issue here.
Interesting.
And so that led us to create kind of a different kind of training, as well as to challenge the idea that safe is so subjective. So what's safe to me and what's safe to you might be very different things. And so why are we creating these stickers or offering these trainings where we think, where someone leaves with a placard or a sticker that says, I am safe. That's what we're indicating. And so we changed the idea of making it safer people and safer places. I can't guarantee anyone's safety.
Okay.
I have to name what is a shortcoming, which is I could never guarantee those things.
Okay.
And instead, let's think about what it means to help change that. And let's create stickers that are mobile, right? So they would stick on a door, but not permanently. So if you wanted to peel it off, it could peel off, right? And the idea of doing that. So I came to thinking about these trainings as something that was really important for colleges and universities to do, and then started wondering, are we actually doing what we say we're doing by offering these trainings? Are we actually providing education? Has it become somewhat transactional where I go to this hour-and-a-half training and I get my sticker, and then that's all the work I put into it? How do we hold people accountable who have gone to the training and then say or do things possibly unintentionally, but possibly for other reasons that I don't know why, things that make students feel like their spaces are not places they could go. And so it's a really long answer to say, I came to thinking about this from being an administrator and wondering, what does it look like to actually create interventions that do transform campus? Knowing that however long that training is, however long that workshop is never going to be sufficient for someone to catch everything, right? To even understand all of the different letters in LGBTQ+, knowing that the plus indicates a whole bunch of identities that we've just stopped listing letters and we're just putting a plus at the end. This additive method. How are you going to learn all of that when there's whole majors and minors dedicated to this?
Yeah, it's not like you're going to replicate all of what you could get in 4 or 5 years of doing a study of something by having 1 or 2 workshops, but there's still a need to somehow prepare the professionals who are working in this environment for an institution that has a mission. You serve everybody, and we know these institutions historically do not serve everyone. But that has changed over the history of this nation, and thus the need then to say, well, how do we actually make that real? So you have written about so many different aspects of this work, and you employed a term, the paradox of opportunities and challenges, that define the work in creating and supporting higher educational spaces and institutions that are more inclusive. So can you tell us why you use that language, the paradox of opportunities and challenges? And can you indicate some of the things that we should be learning from what we've learned about these attempts to intervene?
So my research focused on those who facilitate the trainings, because one of the things that I often felt after I facilitated any of these was that there were really meaningful conversations that I had with my co-facilitators afterwards to process the reactions that attendees had. And I also felt very exhausted afterwards. Like I had put a whole lot of energy into these group of folks, some of whom would stay connected and some of whom I would never see again. And so I was curious, do other facilitators have this experience? Is this just me? It might just be me. And so I set out to do a small exploratory research study, maybe 10 or 15 folks. And within 48 hours, I think, of putting out the call, I had over 50 potential folks.
Wow.
And within 72 hours, I had almost 100 folks who had expressed interest in wanting to participate.
That's remarkable.
Yes, and so I thought, well, okay, I'm underfunded for this. I need to do a little research to figure out how I can increase the number of participants. And I think I hit a nerve. I think there are folks who clearly want to talk about this, so let me give them the opportunity to do this. And I asked them about the history of how the training came to be on their campus, the curriculum itself, what it is they do, some of the logistics, how they describe their own facilitation style, and the benefits and challenges that they felt from facilitating, which is where the paradox came from. And what I heard participants talk about was there were these really beautiful things that came from facilitating these safe zone trainings, or SJEIs, as I call them, social justice educational interventions. And there were also, it was a balance, though, with this other idea, which was a challenge, right? So it was great to be in a community of other people who are there to learn and support and think differently. At the same time, it's incredibly exhausting to put yourself into that space and be that vulnerable, right? Being the person who gets to answer the questions that attendees have to relieve students, mostly, of being asked the same questions, right? So trans and queer facilitators saying, I can answer the question so that that person doesn't ask a trans student and possibly doesn't ask them with the appropriate cover or privacy, or it might feel intrusive that the student is educating the professor about their own personal identity and experience. I can answer those questions. At the same time, they're peppered with these questions that are incredibly intrusive, right? Folks are comfortable, because they do a good job facilitating, surfacing questions that ask people about their bodies, that ask people about their sexual behaviors, that ask people about their sexual histories. Well, that's pretty intrusive, and most of us on a day-to-day basis probably don't have that conversation with other people that we work with, let alone, hopefully, our students.
Right.
And so this paradox of joy and challenge, right? The I know I'm contributing to positive things, and I am even getting positive things out of doing this. At the same time, there is an emotional burden, there is a psychological taxing that also occurs. And that leaves us in this space of, okay, how do we navigate that then? What does that mean for those who facilitate it? How do we support them and prepare them? And I don't know that I have any wonderful answers yet other than to surface that in the 30 plus years since these became commonplace on campus, there is very little empirical research on these. The earliest one was Nancy Evans' work in 2002. That wasn't about the training, it was about folks just putting up a sign on campus, which was incredibly controversial.
Okay.
And in a large state university in the Midwest. A lot of the research that's out there is actually scholarship about how people ended up creating one and how they navigated the political tension of why it was difficult to create it on campus, or they developed an online version of it and what did that look like on campus. There's actually very little specific empirical research on the impact, on the curriculum, on those who facilitate them, and that was a surprise to me. I assumed that I just didn't know what was out there.
Well, you're getting to create that scholarship, though, and so that has to be very exciting as well. We want to invite our viewers to send any questions for our guests, and we have one question already from our audience that asks what our institutions might do to empower and support those who are in charge of these centers that are supposed to be resources for students, those directors of centers, I guess you might call them. So what do you think are some of the things that our institutions can be doing today, even though we don't have close to enough data about some of the effectiveness of specific strategies when it comes to the work that is equipping and educating those who are supposed to provide the instruction to students or the services support to students. But what do you think are some other things that could be done, even if we don't have that data yet, so that our higher ed institutions can provide more support to those who are in charge of directing these centers of that sustain the lives of our students?
I think the first step is to ask the question that I heard Melissa Harris Perry ask once, which is, where does the money go?
Okay.
Right. So, are we funding cultural centers?
Okay.
Are we funding them at the rates in which we expect them to provide? Right. The contradiction or the challenge of having cultural centers is that because they exist, they seem to relieve the rest of campus from feeling like they have a responsibility.
Okay.
Right? Oh, well, let's make sure that the cultural center does that. Oh, name your Heritage Month. That cultural center is in charge of doing all of the work to address that, right? I'm not saying that shouldn't be their work, and where's the work of the rest of the campus to contribute to that?
Okay. So should there be more, even though they're centers, it sounds like you're suggesting there might be more comprehensive and holistic support for the various populations of students. While we might have a center,
Yes.
there also needs to be things happening across the institution. Is that right?
Exactly. I think thinking about what it means to earnestly collaborate, and not just, in higher education, people will co-sponsor, they'll give money, but that's not the same thing as collaborating.
That's a great point.
And so what does it look like to actually have intentional relationships and collaborations? Do we know? Do you know who the cultural center directors are? Have you had shared coffee with them? Have you had a conversation? Have you asked what you can do for them?
Okay.
One of the other pieces of research that I've done is talking to folks who are in various roles in LGBT resource centers about their experiences. And we did a participatory action research project about it. And the folks were talking about the isolation that they feel, the level of responsibility. And I think that's really important. I think when folks think about, well, what can I do? My suggestion would be ask yourself if how your institution engages with cultural centers, if it looks like a form of what Dr. D.L. Stewart called the language of appeasement, of we created this center and therefore that is enough.
Okay.
And ask if there are other ways that this is embedded through strategic planning, through who goes to events, right? Leadership optics matter about who goes to big events, who goes to small events, who students feel like they see in those spaces. They may never recognize who they see, but they notice, right? They may never come up to that person and say, oh, I saw you. And if there's anything I've learned, it's that students often notice when you're not there. And so if we think about what support looks like, there's no one size fits all model. It's what does your institution need? What are students saying? And how are you contributing to what that looks like to help the cultural center with whatever burdens they're carrying to try and meet the needs of students?
Now that makes a lot of sense. And there's several nuggets in there, but one of them particularly that struck me was the distinction between co-sponsoring and collaborating. And co-sponsored, you say there are 5 different organizations on campus. 4 of them can contribute funds to one to do some event, but that doesn't necessarily mean they're participating in any way beyond transferring some funds from one account to another, right? That the sharing the communications and physically being present and actually planning things together and strategizing together, that makes a lot of sense. You spoke earlier about the challenges that a lot of centers have because of their limited funding. And so it sounds like that might be another area that needs to be addressed in order to provide more support to these directors. There's so many dimensions to this work. I know people might be curious about the professional trajectories of those we bring onto the show, and I was wondering if you could share with us what shaped your decisions to become an academic. You mentioned that you'd been an administrator before, but that was in a higher ed context, right?
Yes.
How did you know you didn't want to go into some completely different sector of society? Why higher ed? And at this point now, eventually being a scholar, an academic scholar.
So when I went to college, I was a first-generation college student, and I chose the college I went to, Dickinson College, because it looked like what I thought colleges should look like. It has, similar to Virginia Tech, it has matching buildings, all from the same limestone quarry. It's a small private liberal arts college, and that was the first place that I felt comfortable. As a young queer woman who was not out at home, college was the first place where I felt like I could be myself. Over 5 hours away from my family in this small space with less than 1,800 students. I, of course, was outed by my RA in my first year of college, which was not a pleasant experience. And in some ways, I made the best of it. And that, on a campus of 1,800, it wasn't long before everyone knew who I was and how I identified. And I realized my persistence at that college that I was in love with college environments. And someone that I met early on told me about that you could have a career as a college administrator. And I thought, oh my gosh, I never have to leave campus? Yes, sign me up. What a great job. This is fantastic. College students are wonderful. I'm a college student and I'm wonderful. So obviously I'll love this all the time. And so I knew early on from my first year of college that I wanted to be a college administrator as soon as I knew that that was a thing. I had initially wanted to do politics and was convinced by my mentor, Lana Momsheimer, that I wanted to be an American Studies major instead. And took the first gay studies course that they offered on campus. And I think that really set my path for life and where I was going. So then I got a master's degree in higher education and worked in residence life for a couple of years. Realized that I wasn't happy, that wasn't enough, so I went back to get my doctorate in social justice education at UMass Amherst. Worked in residence life, but was teaching at the same time through another assistantship, and realized that I really wanted to teach. However, it was going to be some time before I was going to follow that path. While I was a doc student, I biomedically transitioned to a man and realized that I had some real life bills I needed to pay, so I became an administrator and became an LGBT center director. I mean, that's what I had been studying. My dissertation was on the experiences of trans men in college, so you know, I was so curious about how other trans men understood masculinity, and that was really the focus of what I was trying to understand. Like, I don't really identify as a man, but I'm definitely not a woman, and I don't really identify with normative masculinity. I do it wrong all the time, and yet like no one mistakes me as anything other than a man wherever I go. And so, do other people experience this? And so I was asking undergraduates about how they were negotiating higher education as trans men. So yeah, so then I worked at that center and I loved it. And at the same time, once I finished my doctorate, I knew I didn't want to move up in student affairs.
Okay.
I couldn't imagine being an assistant vice president. Those jobs are enormous and amazing, and I give credit to everyone who does them. That was not going to be my path. I did not want, as I describe it, my inbox to dictate my every minute of my day.
Well, you know, now there's ChatGPT that can answer your inbox for you. So
Apparently,
maybe we'll never have to do email
really
again. You know?
I should have held out longer. Obviously, I missed that part, right? And so I started looking for faculty positions.
Okay.
And I was lucky enough to receive a faculty position at Western Illinois University, working with Tracy Davis, who writes about men and masculinities, and enjoyed my 4 years there and decided that I still had it's a very teaching intensive institution, and I had big research questions, and I wanted someplace where I could devote my time. And my family's all on the East Coast, and I wanted to get closer to them. And so I was lucky enough to land this position at Virginia Tech. So I've always been teaching. I think when I was in my doc program I've always taught at least one class, probably a year.
Yeah, I was going to ask you if you could share with us some of your insights or experiences from teaching. You know, is there a particular course you've especially enjoyed, or are there particular things you've noticed about the way students engage material in the class, or can you just say a little bit about that?
Yeah, I mean, I love teaching. Most of my training, I think, was more pedagogy than it was research.
Okay.
And so it was very comfortable that was the priority in my first teaching position, in my first faculty position. Undergraduate students are very different than graduate students, the class dynamic.
In what ways?
Well, one, you usually have more undergraduate students in any given class than you do graduate students. And I think graduate students sometimes are trying harder to be smarter.
Okay.
Whereas sometimes undergraduate students are willing to say, like, I have no idea what we're talking about here. And that's, of course, huge generalizations. I love teaching both undergraduates and graduates. It's just been a really long time since I had undergraduates in a course. So yeah, I've been teaching an array of courses. I think it's funny that the courses that I teach are often not things that I study in my research agenda, right? So I was trained in social justice education, and I teach courses on higher education law, on the history of higher education. I have no formal training in either of those areas, and I've had to find ways to make them my own and to develop my own content expertise so that I feel like I am actually providing quality graduate education.
Well, that is one of the skills you learn in the doctoral program, is that how do you become an expert on something? You learn to become an expert on something because you have to keep doing it.
Absolutely.
You're supposed to create new knowledge, and so you end up writing things, books and articles on subjects that you might never have taken a class on when you were a student, but you have to learn how to be an expert on it.
Yes.
Yeah, so that's kind of ongoing. Yeah, no, that's fascinating. What do you think are one or two of the things that it could be a topic, it could be some complicated consensus or disagreement that experts have that your students have to wrestle with? As they're learning this material, are there particular issues or themes that you've just seen have been either incredibly I wouldn't say easy, but incredibly fluid for them to move into and understand, because they're we're introducing new material to them, or are there things that stand out that you realize these particular skills where these particular topics are especially challenging, whether they're grad or undergrad students, for people to really get in and understand. So does anything stand out to you from the teaching that you've done?
I think that one of the things in teaching higher education, right, many faculty across the board think that they know about higher education because they've worked at a higher education institution for their career.
Yeah.
And that's different than understanding how institutions work and function.
Of course, and you're saying that as someone who was an administrator
Yes.
before you started
Yes.
teaching, and you realize the difference with people who've never actually had to be
Yes.
administrators. Okay.
Yes,
All right.
and so thinking about that always frames how I approach any given course.
Okay.
And so, you know, when I think about when I took a history of higher education course as a master's student, I was a terrible master's student because I was more interested in the practical experience of my assistantship. And so I feel like my pay it forward is that now I teach folks for whom they have might have a similar orientation where they want to be administrators, and why do I need to know about the history of higher education? And so my challenge is always, how do I make it relevant?
Yeah.
How do I connect it to practical application for when they become practitioners, when they become educators? And so I actually just co-authored an article about that with a colleague at George Mason, using social justice education as a framework of thinking about self-awareness as a practical skill, critical thinking as a practical skill. And so it's not so much that you have to remember the names, dates, places, those facts, which is how I think a lot of times students come in really hesitant about taking a history of higher ed class.
Yeah.
And instead, how does how this institution came to be shape how this institution will transform? We don't need to just learn practical skills, we need to learn new thinking so that as the future of higher education happens, we are prepared for the things that there's no preparation for.
Yeah.
However, historically, there might be echoes of something that are useful, right? We give land acknowledgements at the start of major events or on our syllabi, or some people in their email signatures. What is the history of where land acknowledgements come from? And what actually is the history of where this land of this institution came from? How does that explain maybe the relationships with the town in which the institution is in?
Yeah.
Or the surrounding communities of that? And so those are historical pieces that may not seem relevant to your day-to-day of how do I deal with a student who's struggling with food insecurity, and yet maybe it does about what partnerships do we need to have with the surrounding community about food pantries or resources for students when we're on break who don't have anywhere to go. What does it mean about relationships that Indigenous students might have to time that's different than how institutions were set up to think about progress to degree? Right? Not every cultural student, not every cultural heritage thinks about time in the same linear way, or thinks that success means I start as a first-year student and 4 years later I graduate.
Right. The quickness of the pace isn't necessarily the index for the quality of the experience, right?
Absolutely.
Yeah.
Sometimes students have responsibilities at home. Sometimes they have to become primary caregivers, and that's true for a variety of students. And so how do we know that relationship, know the historical roots of what used to be or where we need to go? Or as one participant said, how do we examine those moments where we could have created more inclusive environments but made a different choice? And to know that we didn't have to be in the situation that we're in right now. And, to avoid that for the future.
Now that is insightful. We have another question for our audience before we go. I'm wondering if you could address this. The question concerns the fact that LGBTQ plus students are disproportionately affected by housing insecurity. And it's worth noting that although the general public might imagine that college students are living a luxury life with granite countertops and expensive iPhones and what do you call the things you ride on, the roller, the automated roller skates, that the reality is that across all of America, a significant proportion of college students actually experience food insecurity, housing insecurity, and and disproportionately, a lot of LGBTQ students, a larger percentage of them, are especially prone to being housing insecure. Are institutions increasingly aware of this? And based on the work that you've done, what do you think is the sense of attentiveness that our higher ed institutions today are devoting to those particular challenges?
I would say that higher education writ large is aware of food insecurity, of housing insecurity, of all students, and I would hope specifically of how that disproportionately might impact some minoritized student populations, including LGBTQ plus students. I think, though, that's a broad answer to, yeah, I'm sure they do. Whether or not there have been intensive efforts to address that, that's probably a little outside of the area of research that I do. What I can say is that one of the ideas about mutual aid is thinking about how we provide for all of our students and thinking about those who are the least resourced. And this is why I think collaborative relationships across campus are one of the ways that we can create dynamics where students don't fall through whatever netting we have to try and protect them. And so I feel confident that the LGBTQ plus Resource Center here is in relationship with other campus offices that can provide resources for students who are housing insecure. And it also requires us to think about what are our housing requirements, our housing policies, what do we know about, again, the surrounding community and the housing market, the rental market, the prices of groceries and what's happening right now. All of those are contributing factors, and I hope that institutional leadership never assumes that all students have their needs met. And instead, okay, like the way we responded with COVID of being aware that some students, if they were to go home, would not have access to internet, right? Would not have access to be able to be a fully engaged student. And so we created opportunities for them to be able to live on campus without feeling like they were a burden. I think it's that dynamic is what also influences students' perceptions of their own institution.
Yeah, that's true.
Right.
Wow. Well, before we go, what might you share about the most rewarding experiences of your work that you've had? If there's one or two things that's most gratifying, what are those one or two things?
I think in academia, sometimes we are told that we should write alone.
Okay.
And my favorite part is that I rarely write alone. I often write in collaboration with other scholars, whether they're doctoral students. I mean, I work with doctoral students, a couple at Virginia Tech, but a lot at other institutions across the country. And I love that they're just interested in this work, and I get to work with them. I get to think with them. And so I think that's super joyful for me.
Yeah.
And, you know, I love teaching when I teach. I love thinking with. A mentor of mine, Don Johnson, uses the phrase thinking with students instead of thinking for them. And I think graduate education is a lot of thinking with students. And they're brilliant and generative. And their ideas in class often get me excited to want to go do more work. And so I really enjoy the relationships that I have. I think that's probably the most meaningful part of the work. I have wonderful colleagues in my department, and I just feel incredibly lucky, I guess, for the experiences that I have so far.
That is fascinating. Thanks so much, Professor Chase Catalano, for joining us for this conversation. Thank you for joining us for another episode of Vox Humanities Conversations. We invite you to explore other episodes on the Virginia Tech Center for Humanities YouTube channel. You can also listen to episodes of the Vox Humanities podcast wherever you listen to podcasts. For information about the Humanities Center, visit the Virginia Tech Center for Humanities website. For more information about this and other media produced by Virginia Tech Publishing, please visit the publishing website at publishing.vt.edu. Thanks for watching, and we hope you'll join us on a future episode of Vox Humanities Conversations.